Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Chasing Collectibles Catchup. I'm Tyler, and this is actually a very special 50th episode. We've been doing this for a few years. This is episode 50. And to mark this special occasion, I wanted to invite a good friend of mine who actually is the reason I'm here because he's the one that got me hooked to these dangerous things called comics. So please welcome my former teacher and now friend, Brandon Morgan. So thanks, Brandon, for being here.
Well, thank you, Tyler. I'm glad, always glad to sit down and talk with you about comic books. So,
And I still have to train myself not to say like Mr. Morgan because it's
yeah,
still like
no,
ingrained in me.
I
Even though it's
get it.
been so many years.
No, I get it. I get it. But yes, please call me Brandon. That is my preferred name. So
Right. It's no longer 4 o'clock has passed. It's no
that's
longer
right.
school hours.
That's right.
Um,
The bell ring.
before we get into like the bulk of the conversation about the history of comic books, it's like we're both social studies teachers and we both know history stuff. What's your comic book origin story? How'd you first get hooked? I remember you were really into like Marvel comics and Star Wars. So how'd you kind of get the bug initially?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a young man, it was, of course, Star Wars was kind of the be all end all for everything. Growing up there in the mid 80s, and I had older cousins that were very much into Star Wars and comic books as well. I remember the Secret Wars figures
Mm.
coming out, and I had several of those. And vaguely remember at times, my mom taking us to the grocery store or something like that, and just throwing us a comic book to shut my brother and I up, or what have you, and then having comic books around, but especially around like 1987 to 88 in that range, it kind of became one of those things I understood, like, okay, these things come out on the regular. It's not just like a book you get at the library or something. These are serialized things. You start kind of putting those pieces together. So definitely by the time I was getting in that kind of fifth grade, sixth grade transition and all that, I was kind of fully into that. And like I said, had older cousins, and some of them had comic books and reading those. And was fortunate enough to, when I got to middle school, to have a pretty big group of kids right there at that kind of like 1990 cusp of just like this explosion of the 90s. So we got, I read a ton of stuff during that time period because we all had different tastes, different allowances. And so we would just trade books and read. So I feel like probably from about 1990 to about 1995, 96, if it was published, there is a great chance I read it during that time period. So, and just kept with it throughout the years, and all the various things. And today I liken myself to being the kind of classic RPG gamer, where I've played the game so much that now I just run around in a loincloth slapping city guards, and just trying to get my jollies that way. I mean, I just cast a wide net and read lots of stuff. Some of it's good, some of it's really bad, but just enjoy doing it. So.
Right. That's awesome. And I mean, we could go in a whole rabbit hole because we've talked in the past about how like I know like Marvel and DC gets a lot of the attention, but I know you're big into like indie stuff as well, and not necessarily just like traditional superhero stuff either.
Yeah, and that was kind of one of the cool things too about the 90s. It was in a time of, this glut of publishing. You had a lot of different options, and I was very much an early Image adopter. And then of course Valiant was going on, and Dark Horse, and then of course you got things like Stray Bullets.
Mm.
I was fortunate enough to get in right there. Evan Dorkin's Milk and Cheese, all of this kind of stuff before the implosion of like 94, 95. But there was just a lot of good stuff around, and fortunately I didn't just like cast my lot with the X-Men, though that happened quite a bit in the
Right.
90s. But
Well, it must
yeah,
be
it
kind
was.
of cool too. Also thinking about like as an educator, because like I think when because I took your class, I think in 2011, and it was kind of becoming more popular around that time. The movies were coming out, but even now, like now as a teacher, I've got my comic book wall is not as impressive as yours. It's more organized. Yours is just like there's no wall. It's just comic book stuff,
Yeah.
and it's cool having students that like can connect with you because of the comic books. Versus, I'm sure when you were younger, it was not nearly as socially acceptable and cool,
Right.
and you know.
Definitely not. It was not getting me on many social circuits, and like elementary and middle and high school reading comic books. So for sure.
Hmm. Now I can just like I point to stuff, I mention stuff like, oh, I know who that is, and what do you think about that? I'm like, wow, this is so cool, you know?
Yeah, yeah, it is. In fact, I've got some students now who are really into comic books, and we talk about those frequently. Unfortunately, they're more DC fans, but maybe I can
Convert
convert
them.
them to something else.
Well, one more thing just on the education front before we get into like the history stuff is like I've noticed that like in my experience as like a student and also now a teacher too, like I've had colleagues that are really into comic book stuff, and I know you have colleagues, and we know people even at the district office who are really into comic books. Like, is there
Yeah,
like a? It feels like the Venn diagram between comic book nerd and teacher. It's not completely over, but like there is like an
yeah,
overlap. Do you think there's like a reason for that? Like, why do nerds also end up becoming teachers? You know?
yeah. I mean, I think part of that is that you've just got this almost like teachers by nature in a way, especially like I feel like secondary teachers who are
Hmm.
more specialized in their curriculum and their background knowledge. They tend to be kind of nerdy anyway, geeky
Right,
and
about your niche thing,
about
and
their niche, and then that kind of spills over to other behaviors. And I think those of us of a certain age, comic books were it. Video games kind of developed, and I wouldn't say like after me, but especially because I was into video games too. But comic books were like that. That's like really what
right,
stuck, and I think that for a lot of folks that resonates, especially with the new media stuff that's going on with, I say new, but movies and video games and other things that are bringing the comic books in. It's kind of a refreshing thing to see lots of folks who are
yeah,
into it. I'm glad that I'm not the only one having a conversation with myself. So it's good to
yeah.
be able to see that
No,
across the board.
it's
A lot of teachers.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I mean, there is some. I mean, it's not just like I've got there's an English teacher at my school who like Spider-Man's really his like every. It's kind of like your room, but with Spider-Man, where it's just like all just Spider-Man. I mean, it's really cool to be able to have those conversations, and it's a good way to I think connect with the students too when they know that you're like a nerd about something. Like I'm into comics and also the Beatles and Bob Dylan, and I can connect with them on stuff like that. You know,
Yeah, I think that helps build a connection and culture, and it has all these kind of ties. Like, oh, you're a real person. You have things that
right?
go on in your life that don't involve just grading papers. So,
Yeah. Well, ultimately, they're not gonna like. I'll be honest. Like, I only remember a couple things from your class, like specific things from your class that I learned. But I remember like how the teacher made you feel and the cold. You might remember like, oh, that was the guy who really loved comics and he was great. He was funny, and he put my wife and I in a group together, and we didn't realize it. Like all this stuff. Like so, like that's the meaningful stuff. I could really care less at the end of the day. Like, oh, in 10 years, do you remember what this thing in government was?
yeah,
But do you remember? Where you did I make you feel good and as a person
right.
and all that?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that I could do that. I'm glad you got the check for me from me to say all these nice things. So glad
Yeah,
to
we're.
clear the bank.
Well, okay. Education aside, it's 4 o'clock. Bell's rung. Let's get
Yep,
let's get to work on
absolutely. Please.
really the history of comic books because even though comics are more mainstream and kind of everywhere in movies and all that these days, there was a time where they didn't exist until we had the very first superhero. So who was that first superhero that kind of sparked the golden age of comic books?
Well, I think when you look back at, and some people call it the platinum age, especially from the Gilded Age on, when you start seeing a lot of these newspaper strips and political cartoons. After the Civil War, literacy rates went down in the United States, and of course, picture the old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and you've got uh, newspapers wanting to sell their papers to people. Uh, you can't do that if there are a lot of
You
illiterate
can't
people.
read. Yeah.
Yeah, so you started seeing this, especially in the Gilded Age, more and more cartoons. Famously, you've got people like the Hearst papers who are running political cartoons. Of course, the Yellow Kid, all those kinds of things, and kind of like in that platinum era, I think is what some people call it. You've got all these different cartoons that were coming out, so they started to initially serialize those in that kind of comic book format, and most
Hmm.
of them are just newspaper reprints. But I think that when you look at what's called the golden age of comics, Action Comics number one, Superman, that's going to bring in this age of superheroes. Not that we didn't see superheroes, especially those pulp heroes like Green Hornet or Phantom, or even like Conan, like Sword and
Hmm.
Sorcery characters. Those characters had existed, but you didn't have this like masked secret identity superhero kind of stuff that was really going to take over the genre for a really long time. And with rare exceptions, that's what's been the leading genre is this. And I think Action Comics really did, just kind of touched off that whole era. And then you start getting DC publishing more of those. You've got Batman, Wonder Woman, all the characters that start to come in. And then you of course, eventually going to get like Timely, you're going to get Marvel Comics, uh, Submariner, Captain
Right.
America. And then of course by the time like 1940 comes around, like everybody's kind of in on this
Everybody's
gig.
got somebody. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's interesting too, like the what it meant to be a superhero is kind of like first starting here, about like you said, that secret identity, the strength, the feats of strength, the having a weakness, the even like the suit and all that's really cool seeing, like looking back at Superman, that first look of him isn't exactly what we know today, but it is really setting that foundation for the superhero.
Yeah, I've recently, and this might shock you, I've been reading some of the DC Finest collections
Yeah,
that they've been in, and before the Superman movie came out this summer, I was like, I'm going to go back and read that collection they put out of those Golden Age, and I've read some of those collections. I think I had the hardcover or first kind of couple of volumes of hardcovers that had some of those Action Comics in there, but it was really interesting to go back because I think that there's a lot of that DNA that's there. I mean, yeah, is it recognizable today, like fully recognizable, especially with his powers? His power sets have grown exponentially.
right.
But and I think that was partly just because anytime a writer got themselves into a situation or an artist got themselves in a situation, they were kind of like, how am I going to get Superman out? Oh, well, now he's got x-ray vision.
Yeah,
Or,
he
or
can do
now,
this, and
yeah, but I'm going to, he's been able to lift a car, but now I need him to lift an 18 wheeler,
right,
kind of more followed function there. But I mean, looking back at those old tales, I think that they're really great. I think they're reflective of the time, especially you start looking at like 1938. Of course, the Depression had been going on. You have the New Deal. The New Deal is still not really working. You kind of have that depression inside of a depression that's going on. I know a lot of people tend to think of, oh, well, we're already kind of getting towards the arsenal of democracy. We're not quite there yet.
right,
And we are having a lot of these folks, or a lot of these like kind of weird comic book things that they're trying to reflect the real world. And I think Superman reflects that. If you go back and look at his villains, it's kind of like the robber barons, the industrialists, it's
right. Yeah,
bankers, it's corrupt businessmen. It's very much the social issues, kind of giving hope in a hopeless world. And eventually, of course, you're going to see it all across those comic books that are going to come after Superman as we start getting towards World War II. The Japanese and the Nazis kind of become the big boogeyman. But I love Superman in the beginning just because he's got all these really, I think that especially the movie this past summer, hope is a superpower,
right.
and I think, well, gee, that's how you can go
It's the
back to
beginning.
number
Yeah,
one and see that and read all of those stories in the early Action Comics, and that's it. Superman is hope.
yeah. Well, I think you put that brilliantly, and I think as it's cool too, or interesting as like a historian looking back as we get into that World War II era of how like I know today, and I don't want to talk about modern politics, but I do want to say that like sometimes you get the feel that like people will say things like, "Well, I want my comics and my politics to be separate. Like comic
Mhm.
books shouldn't be political."
Yeah.
But I mean, you look at the 40s, and it's like Captain America number one. It is literally Captain America punching Hitler in the face. And then you've got so many covers that are like buy war bonds. You have
Mhm.
these issues where it's like Superman and Batman and Robin throwing rocks at the Axis powers' faces. And like some of these artists are not very nicely drawn when we're looking about like racy stuff. So I mean it's like it's in your face, the way that superheroes were used in conjunction with the war.
Yeah, and I think that one of the great things, and superheroes are kind of science fiction in a way. I think one of the great things about science fiction is that it's always given, even though it might be about the future or it might be about the fantastical, it's always been in a way about a reflection of who we are as a society at that time. And I do think that with Superman and of course Captain America, but I've been reading a lot of air fighter comics and Airboy from that World War II era, and they are reflections of the time. And yes, the art sometimes can be, especially in viewed with a modern lens, very racial caricatures, very not PC kind of stuff, but they are, it is interesting to view that and see how they were depicted because it was
Yep.
propaganda.
What does that tell you about the people and
Yeah,
the
what does that tell
feelings
you
of the
about
time?
people? And I've always found it fascinating, especially with Captain America. That's what several months before we even enter the war, and
That's
it's
right.
it's almost like hey, and even Airboy. If you go back to look at some of those comics, Airboy's fight, and of course all the air fighters because they had different features. They're all fighting. Some of them were British, so they were already fighting the
Right.
Nazis. But you think about like Airboy or Skywolf or some of those characters that were really popular in the early 40s. They were Americans, and they were, we hadn't declared war. Pearl Harbor hadn't happened, and yet
Right.
here we are fighting the Nazis and trying to do
Hmm.
our best. Like, and I think that is in and of itself kind of interesting to look at, to think, because as I present it to my students, FDR is going to really work hard to get us involved in that war,
Yeah.
while at the same time, kind of saying very overtly,
He's
I'm going to keep
straddling
us
that
under
line.
control, that kind of thing. But
Hmm.
no, we were really working towards that, and I think it was pretty obvious to at least some people
Right.
that that's what we were doing. And you look at Captain America one, again, you see a lot of that stuff that we recognize as Captain America there. And of course, that story has been told so many times, not only in comic books, but obviously the first Captain America movie. Which I think did a really brilliant job with how it presented, not just and kind of almost like it's a hokey story, right? Like
Yeah.
especially to jaded 21st century Americans. We look at, oh, he's going to go and fight this war and do all this like kind of Boy Scout kind of stuff. But I really think they pulled it off well, showing
Mm.
that kind of pull of at that time. There were people who wanted to get us involved, and there were people who maybe wanted to be involved in the war effort that couldn't, and everybody was supposed to be sacrificing. And here's Steve Rogers doing that. But of course, you've got Batman, Superman, others
Yeah. Yeah.
dealing
They're
with
involved. And
Nazis, and so it's kind of like this thing of like everybody's involved, everybody's got to do their part, whether that's and that's part of the reason why comic books were so popular. They were cheap, they were easily carry, you carry them around. Soldiers could get those and carry them around from place to place, much easier than books.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
and then also why they will eventually become that golden age era is so scarce. Why they're so
right,
expensive today when you try to find a golden age comic is because like people crumbled them up. People sometimes return them to donate to the war and all that. So like that's why it's so hard to find those early comics in good condition because they're like you didn't care about them back then. You rolled them up,
right.
you ripped them up, you know.
Yeah, even terrible copies. Like this summer, as I was, this past year or so, as I've started to read like Airboy and the Air Fighters, I was like, oh, I'm going to go back and see if I can just own an issue. And like even that, which was not considered like a popular, hugely popular, especially by comparison to Captain America or to say Superman. Those issues can run in terrible condition, hundreds of
Oh yeah.
dollars. Action Comics one sold recently, I think in 2024 for 6 million uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
dollars, and there's maybe less than 100 copies of that are out there that we know of. Uh, I think that's part of why comic books were special then, and I think
Mhm.
special even up through the Bronze Age, because they were not seen as high art
Yeah.
as we might take them today, or collectibles, or
Mhm.
anything like that. So there's definitely some scarcity involved
For sure.
when it comes
Tying
to
in
that.
that econ.
Yeah, right, Right. Supply and demand. The
Right,
supply of those golden age books are very, very, very limited. So
right. Well, I'm trying to treat this almost like a survey level course because like we could for each
yeah,
era we could really do a whole episode
correct.
on
We can
every
dive
era.
right in. Yeah.
So let's go a little bit into the 50s. So something starts to
Okay.
happen in the 50s. This code, this comic books code is created. But what's before we get into the code itself, like what's going on in the 50s? Because like there's also this other media in general, TV, movies, is being accused of something by
Yeah.
people in Congress. Like what's going on?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of things change for comic books besides seduction of the innocent, and you've got a lot of stuff that's going on in society. Television starts to become really popular, and that starts to compete for your dollars. Uh, Also, the superhero starts to go out, and
Yeah,
that's not again because of seduction of innocence. It's for a lot of reasons. I mean, you're especially the war focus is over. So a lot of people are kind of moving from that, and you've got other genres that take
sci-fi is
over.
getting big.
But yeah, and then of course you've got this Red Scare. We enter this nuclear age, kind of post World War II. The world's different. It's and that's not an understatement. It's literally different,
Right.
and I think that you start to see people who just like after the First World War, thinking like, oh well, society is fraying at the sides. We've got to blame something,
Right.
and I do think that comics presented a convenient whipping boy, if you will, that comics are and the genres were wild. I mean, you've
Yeah.
got superheroes, you've got romance, you've got horror, and some of those, like especially EC, if you go back and look at those pre-code books,
Some of
they
them
are
were wild. Like I know so we try to blame, oh, this is just them kind of overreacting. Some of them were a bit like there's the famous cover of them like holding the severed head. I mean, it was a bit, you know,
yeah. So yeah, when you add all of this kind of tension in society, and then kind of saying like, well, the kids are different, you got
Mhm.
to start finding, okay, who is, what could be the source, and comic books kind of become the source, or at least one of those, and people, especially eventually when rock and roll and others come around, oh goodness, what's going on, what's happening with the kids, the teenagers are all acting crazy. So comic books become that, and of course that as we start getting, not just in comic books and society, the suspicion of people who are creating content, and looking at academia, and looking at Hollywood, comic books get swept up in this, and to get ahead of themselves, of course they create the Comic Code Authority to try and show
They
like,
being the comic book creators and
yeah, look, we're gonna take care of this. We'll police ourselves.
mhm.
Congress doesn't have to be walking through the halls of your funny book company. We can police ourselves with this, and try to make sure content is okay. And that was, especially all media at this time was supposed to be presenting this kind of idealized version of America. That
Right.
kind of Norman Rockwell society, and you see that in television. Television is very, creative, new, but also very
Very safe. Yeah.
sanitized. You're going to see this kind of idyllic United States, because we have to compare ourselves to the godless communists and the
Right.
heathens of the East.
Hmm.
So we're trying to monitor all that stuff and make sure that the message is getting out is this message. And I think that's part of the reason why DC turned so cheesy at
They
this.
overcorrect almost. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was like an overcorrection where you get, and not that comic books weren't always cheesy. I mean, they were. Even that World War II stuff, which could be really kind of hardcore sometimes.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you've got Captain America and Bucky, laughing things off. There's
Yeah.
sergeants yelling at them, and but yeah, this overcorrection here. It even like. So Captain America stops publishing, and you get the Fighting American. You get Kirby and Simon, who are like, well, we're not going to write this. So let's write that. If you look, and I think there were only like 8 or 9 issues published of the original Fighting America in the 1950s. But at first, the first couple of issues are totally serious about this, going after the communists. But then after about the third issue, second or third issue, they start like kind of sending it up like, okay, this kind of stuff is ridiculous. And they're wildly hilarious. It's satire. You can see it's making fun of McCarthyism, but also trying to like stick
Oh, that
to what
line.
is
Yeah,
saying and all that. But it's pretty hilarious stuff to see that. But then you look at DC. I don't think there was any satire involved in that. Like if
yeah.
you go back and look at some of that stuff, it's just cheesy. And
Yeah, I mean, people. You see some of those, like the Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. Those are wild. The whole like some of the
yeah,
Batman stories are just wild. People wonder how do you get Batman 66? I mean, this is
yeah,
that era where
yeah, yeah. Especially thereafter, especially got in that kind of swinging '60s. Let's make Batman, and he almost became a joke. And I think that's something later on, like people like Stephen King. I think he wrote in the forward to like Batman 400 or something like, hey, Batman was on the ropes for a lot of reasons, but from like the
yeah,
1950s on, today, DC's line is basically 50% Batman. But you start looking at those titles back then. He had like four titles, and you have like a lot of really hokey stories. Now they're fun to read, great fun, especially you turn your brain, especially if you've only read post Frank Miller Batman. Going back to read like the 1950s and 60s
sure,
Batman
it's a trip.
is it is a trip. You will be like, is someone punking me? Is this someone playing a prank? They are not. It's just that cheesy, and it's kind of wonderful to look at now, but
Mhm.
it really was intentional almost to be like, hey, this audience is children. It's like once you get past a certain age, you're out of Batman because you probably don't want him making muffins with the Riddler, right? That's not a really great story, or at least
I
one
don't
that's
know
got
why that. I
attention.
don't know
When
why they didn't allude to that in the latest Batman movie. They should
I
have had a
know,
scene.
I definitely want to see Paul Dano making some muffins with
Muffins with his scary mask.
Patterson. Yeah, like, do you want more chocolate chips? Yeah.
Well, so speaking of earlier, I said, things that stick with me as an
Yeah.
educator. I distinctly remember you because we used to ask, sometimes like intentionally to get you off topic so we could not do school. We'd
Sure.
ask you questions
Absolutely.
about like which is better, DC or Marvel. And you would always say that like DC, it's more about the superhero.
Yeah.
Marvel is about the person.
Correct.
So what does Marvel do in the 60s that really kind of defines them and really introduces us to a lot of these characters that we kind of love today?
Yeah, and I think that DC it has great character. I mean,
Mhm.
both companies have absolutely great characters, but especially with what Marvel was doing, what Stan and Jack and Ditko and all those guys that were, Wally West, all those guys that were working at Marvel at the time were doing. They were of course doing comics differently, using the Marvel method, but injecting people into this
Right.
in a lot of ways. And again, you have to understand none of these characters, DC, Marvel, especially those, were never intended to be like 80 year, go 80 years,
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff. Nobody intended it and was taking it that seriously. But I think Marvel took it to a degree a little more seriously, especially by comparison to what DC was publishing at the time,
Mhm.
right? And you look at what they were publishing, and it was kind of childish. I think Stan and Jack and those guys were injecting these comic books with humanity. Sure, you were going to have someone like Peter Parker. Spider-Man was going to he's going to be a hero, but you can't have Spider-Man, out there punching Doc Ock without also having him worry about, oh yeah, Aunt May told me I needed to go get some milk. And I
Right.
have forgotten that 2 days in a row. If I show up today without milk, Aunt May is going to kill me. Or hey, I'm supposed to go to the movies with Harry. I can't stand him up again because like he's going to be really mad. So you have like this very human element that I feel like was missing. You probably are remembering me, and I've thought this for years. Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and Spider-Man
Mhm.
is Peter Parker. Like, Spider-Man is the mask. Uh, for Batman, Bruce Wayne is the mask. I mean,
I think that's a quote I was remember basically essentially something like
yeah,
that. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, Bruce Wayne, you can almost go, and I'm reading. Tom King's Batman right now.
Mm.
I'm way behind on
Right.
things, but
So that was a few years ago.
yeah, that was a few years ago. Bruce Wayne shows up kind of occasionally, but it's just kind of like, here's your token panel of Bruce Wayne. The rest of it is
Right.
Batman, right? Uh, I don't think you could get away with that in a Marvel book. There's so much, even like I'm reading some of the more recent Hulk runs now, even in the like new Amazing Spider-Man with Kelly Spider-Man, I think is who's writing it now. Joe Kelly, you've got to have uh, almost like what Rob Liefeld and others talk about, that 787 breakdown. You got 7 pages kind of an action, then you have like kind of 8 pages of character development and checking up on the cast of characters, because that's the thing. Like you would have a cast of characters.
Yeah.
You would have your supporting cast. What was going on in Aunt May's life mattered. What was going on in Gwen Stacy's life mattered. What was happening at the high school and
Mm.
college mattered to Peter Parker, and that was the same for every Marvel book. You would
Yeah.
have that, kind of like that 8 pages and then 7 pages setting up the action again. But you would have like that was just an integral part. Like when you picked up an issue of Spider-Man, sure, you wanted to see him punch Green Goblin, but at the same time, you wanted to check up on Harry. You wanted to
Yeah.
make sure that those characters, and if they didn't show up, you were probably writing
Mm.
Marvel saying like, "Hey, it's been a
What's
few
going on?
issues since you've seen Harry. What's going on? Is he doing anything?" Like, or like, Aunt May was having to go to the cardiologist. How did that turn out?
Right.
So Marvel definitely, I think that was one of their particular inventions. If you look back those Hulk stories, I mean, Bruce Banner is a character, and it's such an easy concept of saying like, that am I a monster, or is that is the Hulk the monster?
Right.
We're both monsters, and that kind of inner turmoil that's very human for us. Whereas you've got Superman is basically a god. He's a nice
Right.
person. Right? He's basically a god, or Batman. The only thing that we can keep from the Snyderverse is that line of, hey, what's your superpower? I'm rich.
Right.
That makes him a god. But yeah, when you look at even the Fantastic Four, you have that
Sure.
family dynamic. You've got all the family stuff that's going on, and it's such a wonderful play there. I mean, I feel like I wish the Fantastic Four movie this summer, which was very much aping this time period. It's
Mm.
a lot of family dynamic and a lot of that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. I wish we had seen more of Johnny and Ben going at each other.
Hmm.
You get a little bit of
Definitely
that.
some missed opportunities. Yeah.
Yes, some missed opportunities, but I mean, and a lot of people, I think one of the big complaints that I heard was from that movie was there just wasn't enough action. There's a lot of character
Yeah.
moments, and it's like
Well, that's
kind of
kind of
it,
the point.
yeah, that's kind of the old Marvel '60s. Now, if they were doing something, maybe John Burns, but even in later, like if you go to the Bronze Age, if you go to the modern age, especially if you look at Ryan North's Fantastic Four right now, which is one of the few Marvel books I'm actually keeping up with. Man, that's the family element that's there. Sure, you're going to have the action and science adventures and stuff like that, but what they're doing as a family and as people, that's what matters. And I think that's what Marvel particularly did well. And not just making like, all right, we're not going to have a whole issue of Matt Murdock walking around as Daredevil. No, he's
Yeah.
going to be talking with Foggy and Karen, and maybe his twin brother Mike's going to show up.
Mhm. And that's a really like if you're a Marvel collector, really the bulk of like those first appearances of those characters you truly care about are happening in the Silver Age, and there's just so many. I mean, we could sit here and list for the next 30 minutes
Sure.
all the characters that come out during that era. And there's even so many, again, this is this is the 101 version of this course, but I mean, we look at the X-Men, we could go into what does Professor X's worldview versus Magneto's worldview
Sure.
represent, the whole, MLK versus Malcolm X. You could look
Sure.
into Black Panther. I mean, so much is created in the Silver Age that's just huge
Yeah.
for Marvel.
Yeah, and huge for DC. I think DC
Yeah.
had some great works at that time period as well, but definitely, I think I think DC from the time Marvel really hit in the early '60s, DC was kind of playing behind the ball and trying to catch
Mhm.
up. By the time they get to the Bronze Age, I think you are starting to see more sophisticated stories on the part of DC, especially like Neil Adams, folks like that coming in, right, with his Batman, and then of course Green Arrow, Green Lantern, all of that stuff helps mature them into that Bronze Age.
So let's talk about that in the Bronze Age. One comic book that's very famous is like this is Green Lantern and Green Arrow number 85, and the cover is Green Arrow's Ward Speedy shooting up, right?
Yeah,
Drugs. I mean, that's like on the cover. You can't even, that's not even subtext. That's not like, oh, that's halfway through. That's in the
right.
front cover. I mean, that's wild. So what is the Bronze Age? Like, how does that capture this Bronze Age time?
I
You
think
know?
I think you were starting to see. I would say some outright challenges to the comic codes, and because we, of course, had exited at this point the Red Scare. We were still in the
Mhm.
middle of the Cold War, but the whole hysteria had died down, and I think people had been able to contextualize at that point that the the whole comic books are creating problems kind of stuff. I don't know, especially like you can look at we've clearly moved past by the time the Bronze Age, especially mid 70s. On television you're starting to get that kind of hokey stuff is gone. They're
Yeah,
starting to
so you've
mature.
seen Vietnam
Yeah,
projected in your homes
Vietnam.
and
Yeah,
Watergate, just scandals and
yeah, all that stuff. We kind of grew up as a nation. Our innocence is lost, and I think that you're starting to see. And I think Marvel also did that. Marvel, in a way, has always been like world outside your door or outside your window. You can kind of see the reflections of that, but you start seeing things where we are taking social issues, because social issues are important. I mean, especially if you're looking late 60s, early 70s, as you start seeing all these the civil rights movement in the mid 60s, that's getting actual legislation, but then it's like not necessarily changing the social, political, economic mores of our nation, and people are frustrated with that. And you start seeing other groups besides African Americans. You've got women, you've got Native Americans. Eventually, by the end of the 80s, disabled people. You've got all these different groups that are bringing these issues up, that you start seeing that reflected in the
yeah,
comic books, that you get this kind of real world sense. And I think you get the creatives behind it too, people who are reflective of that time period. You've got someone like Neil Adams or Starling or Howard Chaykin or any of these guys that kind of get their start there in this time period. And they're starting to, I think that those social issues matter to them. And it
yeah,
starts to bleed into the books. Whereas I think earlier, even Stan and Jack, they wanted to make comics relatable, but they didn't want it to be like too much like, okay, let's do an issue on the Vietnam War. Let's
right.
do
You
an
can
issue.
still escape.
Yeah, this is still kind of escape. Whereas now you're starting to get that social awareness and consciousness that maybe, going back to what we were talking about, maybe we do want to separate politics sometimes, but at the same time, we are
It's
trying to reflect.
there.
Yeah, it's there. These problems exist, and I think tackling things like drugs, like in that issue, are really important. And
Mhm.
Spider-Man tackles it. All sorts of issues get tackled during this time period, but it is kind of an era of contradictions too. You've got these kinds of things going on, but then the comic code apparently was, I don't want to say always, but frequently on titles like Ghost Rider, Son of Satan. Like,
It's
okay,
like, huh?
what are you doing here? Like, but I think that everybody was pushing the envelope in a way,
Mhm.
because I think that they understood that these were important issues that need to be talked about, and that
Yeah,
comics could, as we're maturing as a medium, we don't just have to have guys in spandex punching each other. We can
right.
actually tackle some of these issues, and I would say that's an OG thing. Go back to that
Yeah.
Action Comics and see what Superman was talking about in those first like couple of years. It's just rich with social commentary, and I think even those World War II books, we're dealing with the war, so you get some of that becomes a part of the comic books. And I think especially by the time that we get into the 80s, at the end of the Bronze Age, and you've got people like Miller and Moore, Frank Miller and Alan Moore, who are working in the medium. and they're bringing in that deconstruction, which
Yeah,
is kind of looking at our systems and looking at how we live life, and it just kind of naturally has sprung from all that. And I think you have to have issues like Green Lantern, Green Arrow 85 to be able to tackle that kind of stuff, because you
right.
can't just like make
You
that
can,
leap. It's got to be
right. You got
those
to
kind of
take your
changes.
time.
Right.
Let Well, let's start getting into then the 80s and all
Yeah.
that, because like this brings us into the modern era. Some people call this like the copper era, but I was like online, it's a little disputed about when would this begin.
Yeah.
But we really started to get some of this kind of darker stuff.
Yeah.
Also, more of like kind of like sometimes called the galaxy brain storylines, where it's like we're getting weird. We're having Crisis on Infinite Earths, we're having Secret Wars, we're doing stuff that you really gotta. We go back to the beginning of this discussion about like people can't read. Now you got to read. I mean, this stuff is like you got to sit there and really read the book to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So having grown up in the 80s and 90s, like what is this era all about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as the Bronze again, as we start looking at what the ages are and what comics, I think the Bronze Age definitely the latter part of it with the crossovers, as you're starting to get those uh, with Secret Wars and Crisis, which are both, especially Crisis gets a little dark at times towards some of those issues, but especially when you get in the end of the Bronze Age, in the early 80s, like or late 70s, early 80s, you have Miller on Daredevil, and that's just revolutionary. He's changing Daredevil fundamentally.
Right.
And you start getting that kind of more mature, but especially by the time you get Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, those books are saying we want, because I think Stan, one of the things that Stan and Jack did was they realized that DC in the 1950s and had lost the teenagers and lost
Yeah.
older kids like college kids, so they start appealing towards that. I think by the time we get to the 80s, we're starting to think, okay, well, how do we appeal to that group as they move on?
Right.
How do we get someone maybe in their mid 20s or 30s to continue to read comic books and not just see this as a kind of childish platform or a childish kind of excursion into the past? Well,
And then
you
they ki-
mature,
they
and I
kill a
think
Robin by vote.
kill Robin by vote, right? Or you get somebody like Alan Moore, who was doing some fantastic work in Britain. I mean, some of that stuff, especially when he comes on with Swamp Thing, when you look at Miracle Man, Marvel Man, you look at all the stuff he's doing with that stuff. Eventually, his Captain Britain, like everything is just so mind blowing. Like this
Right.
guy, he's a writer, and I think that much more common, or at least especially for the Marvel style, was allowing the artist to tell the story,
Mhm.
and then you kind of come back and fill in the blanks. Well, now you've got the writers who are up front. You've got the story is first, and I've heard artists talk about Alan Moore's process of writing like this huge script, and saying like, all right, in this panel you're going to draw Batman taking a needle out of a junkie's arm, but it needs to have 3 driplets of blood. And that first drop needs to go down and form the J because Joker's going to be down the road. So you've
Right.
got like these kind of like really detailed scripts. Whereas I feel like Stan and Jack could meet for a Fantastic Four issue, and Stan would be like, "Wow, I think we should have them fight someone called Galactus," and
Right.
Jack would go off and do that
Yeah.
and come back, and that's it. He would write in the stuff and move on. Well, now you've got these writers some people say, well, they should have been novelists, but
Yeah.
I don't. Sure, I think Alan Moore's got some great novels that he's written in the last couple of decades, because he's moved away from comics. But I think that kind of making it more of a literate thing helped
Mhm.
with making comic books more
I think it
mainstream. To
legitimized it, right? Because like back in the day, like, oh, being a comic book author would be considered like a subpar, like I don't want to do that. But now it's getting like, no, I can make this into really, like you said, the high art, get
Right.
really different with this.
Right. And that in and of itself is going to, I think that once you've got Daredevil, Miller's Daredevil, of course, his year one, Batman, Dark Knight Returns. Once you've got Alan Moore Swamp Thing and Watchmen, uh, you've got these really sophisticated, and I would even say Grunwald's Squadron Supreme for Marvel. I think a lot of times gets overlooked by Watchmen. I think that that's Marvel's Watchmen. You start seeing this more mature take, and I think that that really starts to have a big impact on what does it mean to be a comic book writer? What does it mean to have a comic book? Are we now just doing these? Are we now just doing this kind of guys fighting, or are there real stories we can tell
Right.
that go beyond just the fisticuffs and go beyond those kind of simplistic things of the past? And you do
Mhm.
kind of get into this headspace where things are very cerebral,
Yeah.
and you're covering topics that would make Speedy blush in number
Yeah.
85 of Green Arrow and Green Lantern. You're starting to get things that are, especially you're starting to, in the 1960s and 70s, you start getting independent comics, and
Mhm.
they're kind of running, and they kind of legitimize. I think by the 1980s you start seeing things like Love and Rockets. You start seeing Cerebus. You start seeing Mouse eventually. So you start seeing these comic books that are evolving beyond just the kind of four color panel things that had been dominating the genre really since Action Comics.
Yeah. Well, one thing as we're again closer to modern day, and again, there's so many things like we could go in the rabbit hole about like the bubble of the '90s and the
Oh yeah,
speculation behind Death of Superman and all that. I want to talk about too as like we're getting to modern day because we're talking like 80 plus years of history.
yeah,
And we've seen DC and Marvel on occasion. We've seen it in like 2011, 2015 and all that. We've seen them occasionally do like reboots and relaunches.
yeah.
So what are the for like maybe a casual fan, like what is the purpose of these things? Where they occasionally like DC's like New 52 or Rebirth or Marvel's like Marvel Now or and everything's at number one. What's the purpose of all of these things that happen on occasion?
Yeah, I think both Marvel and DC approach it a little bit differently. I think DC approaches it with just like, let's just kind of rip the bandage off and kind of start with a new fresh coat of paint. I think Marvel has always just kind of like, don't think about it too hard when we do
Yeah, I don't
these
think they've ever rebooted in the way
soft
DC
reboots,
has.
or
Yeah.
like, but I think the purpose, I think what they want to do is bring in new readers. Comic book readership has declined.
Mhm.
I do think that DC has done a very great job recently with their Absolute line.
Yeah,
I,
that's super cool. I love it.
yeah, I'm not a big DC guy, but I do really love Superman and Wonder Woman. Absolute Batman's okay. I'm not sold on this lizard Joker thing. But I haven't read it yet. I've been like trade waiting these things,
Right.
but I do think that when they do books like Marvel did the Ultimate line, and has like kind of a new Ultimate line, though that one's kind of weirdly ending. I think what they want to do is show that sure, these characters, they're at their base, here's their core principles, but we can tell new stories. And I think that with varying degrees of success, when you look at New 52 and Rebirth, some characters I feel like came out on top, some characters not so
Yeah.
much. I feel like Batman pretty much virtually did not change at all. He just kind of continued and kind of does his bat thing,
Right.
as he always does. But I think like some characters like Superman haven't really landed, or like when they brought in Bendis, right? I think that was Rebirth, if I'm
Yes.
remembering
Yeah.
correctly. Um, when they brought Bendis in, I think they were trying to inject some of that Marvel pizzazz, but I think Bendis was probably burnt out on the superhero stuff at that point.
Right. Yeah.
But now Marvel's bringing him back. But yeah, I think that both companies, and they should be interested. I mean, going back to Jim Shooter's idea, everybody's everybody's comic is somebody's first, and
Right.
what do we need to cover in that? And that's kind of clunky, especially if you go back and read some of that Bronze Age stuff. Like, every issue you've got to have Spider-Man talk about, well, my powers are, and it's like,
Right.
okay, but somebody didn't know that, and I
Yeah.
think that's why these lines are so important, to bring in some of that, and to bring in some of those new readers. I think
Especially with the movies. I mean, movies are like people
movies,
wonder, okay, like Iron Man's dead in Endgame. What where can I ever see him again? Like,
yeah,
or you could read the comics, can we,
not that we would ever get evidence from the big two these days, but I think that anecdotally, I think everybody can agree that the movies and video games and other media things have not brought the readership in the way that you might have thought, especially
Yeah.
because I think now the price of comics is affecting that. When you
Mhm.
start talking about $5-6 an issue, you start thinking like bang for
Anniversary ones are 10.
yeah, and then you've got these different volumes, and it can be a little confusing. I think Marvel has been the lead offender, and just the constant reboot cycle of every time they have a new creative team, they go back to
Slap on
number
number one.
one. And I think that's I don't know if that's serving the purpose that they're hoping in bringing in those new readers.
Mhm.
I think that it's just got to go back to the storytelling. You've just got to tell
Yeah.
tell a good story. I personally don't believe that you need heavy continuity, and I think that the Absolute line shows that. I mean, the Absolute
Right.
line is in a lot of ways turning continuity on its head,
Yeah.
and say, we don't have to have I don't have to have the traditional Batman story. I can have Alfred be like this awesome guy,
Hmm.
kind of like secret agent man, and Bruce Wayne can kind of be this kind of grungy dude. He doesn't have to be a billionaire or
Right.
whatever. But I think that it's more. I think that Absolute Line is more than just a fresh coat of paint. I think it's a fresh perspective. I do think, at least for Absolute Batman, I think they're going after the anime manga crowd. I
Right.
think Wonder Woman is very much it's not necessarily doing that, but it is playing with the mythos enough, and giving this strong characterization. I think Superman is also playing with the mythos in a way that you wouldn't imagine.
Right.
So I think it's really creative, and I think that shows that, yeah, fans, sure, they might show up for new takes, but at the same time, they show up for quality. Put
Right.
those quality creators, and I don't think Marvel's got good quality right now. Uh,
I do think sometimes, and I try to be very positive on whenever we talk on this
yeah,
show because I prefer positivity over,
yeah, sure,
just bashing stuff. But I
yeah,
sometimes I think Marvel can lean too much and like, okay, they're always going to buy this title, which I mean, I'm an offender of this is I still always
yeah,
buy Amazing, even though the writing isn't always amazing on it, like so I'm
right,
like, sometimes I think they use it as a crutch. Okay,
yeah,
everyone's going to buy Batman, everyone's going to buy Amazing, so
yeah.
you know,
So I think that I think the Absolute Line, I think why you didn't see like New 52 or Rebirth strike in the same way that this Absolute Line has, is that it's just I feel like if you go back and look at the history of the New 52, there's a lot of micromanaging and things like that.
mm,
I I think that DC's just kind of letting these creators run with it. And,
yeah,
and I think that's why Image Comics is so popular right now, because that's just like their ethos, right? Like you're just gonna give the there's no editorial mandate that X, Y, and Z has to happen, and I think fans are gravitating towards that, both to Image and to DC right now, maybe over Marvel, because they're doing such a good job. And I think that that's great because DC hasn't done a great job with these reboots. But I think that fans are gravitating to that because it is quality, because people
right,
do recognize that, wow, this is really different, and each book has their own voice. I haven't read Martian Manhunter or any of the others, but by the things that I've read online, like, people really enjoy the voice that's
right,
coming
yeah,
through. That's not just writing, it's the art too. It's so
yeah,
distinctive, it's so creative. When I flip through, because again, I'm trade weighting all these, but like I'll pick up an issue in the store and just look at the art of an Absolute Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman, and it's just fantastic. You could just
Right.
it's almost
You can
like
feel it.
energy is just coming right off the page, and that's a fantastic place for comic books to
Yeah.
be in.
Well, I think too, it's like I felt the same thing with a lot of the movies. You know, the if you look like the way that I feel about the best Marvel and best DC movies are the ones where you can feel like they were just focused on letting the creatives do their thing. A
Right.
lot of like the movies I haven't liked in the past have been ones that are like, okay, in order for this big thing to happen down the road, we need X, Y, and Z to happen. You know, so this person needs to find this thing that's actually this stone down the road and all that. I much rather that's independent thing that's like showing the creator's voice and all that. And I think that's the best stuff in comics as well, you know?
Yeah, and I think that that's when you look at someone like Image or Boom or any of these other companies, like to a degree IDW, I think, but especially like some of the stuff that's coming out of Boom. I think that's where Something is Killing the Children,
Right.
and trying to remember what's the Keanu Reeves. I know I've read them all.
Uh,
uh,
Another one you're talking about. Can't think of it
uh,
right now, but yeah.
yeah, see, this is middle age catching up with me because I've read all of those Keanu. But you've got that. You've got the Image books like uh, Exquisite Corpses, Saga. The
Yeah,
you know
there's
you've got
brilliant
all the
stuff out there that is not Marvel and DC, and that's
yeah,
just letting the creatives do their thing.
titles. Yeah, that's it's just all really fantastic, and you feel the creators there, and you
Right.
feel that there's buy into that book, not just because like, hey, we're protecting IP, we have to publish a comic book of this that's out there, and I think that even DC kind of feels like that with their non-absolute books, and it's kind of like, hey, why don't you do that
Yeah.
here?
Right. Well, I feel like later down the road we could come back and visit so many different topics. Like we could do a
Oh yeah,
deep dive into so many of these things that we've had to gloss over. But I wanted to ask this as we're wrapping up here. Who like if you had to like when I was in your class as like a 15-year-old, however old I was back then, and the young person says, "Hey, I really want to start reading comics." What is the advice you would give them for how to start, given all this history and everything we've talked about?
yeah. I mean,
That's such a hard thing. Where do you
yeah,
start?
yeah. I think it really comes down to two things. Okay, is there a character that you're drawn to? So if you've seen like, oh, I saw the Spider Verse movie, is there a place that I can check out? Spider Gwen
Mhm.
or Miles Morales, or if there's like a genre, a creator that you've heard about. Because someone like Scott Snyder or Dan Mora, any of those guys or even Robert Kirkman, right? Who's kind of like, or Todd McFarlane, these guys who are kind of their own cottage industry. You could
Right.
approach it like that. It's very hard. I don't think of a title as being like, okay, here's a universal title that I can just lay in somebody's
Mhm.
lap. Uh, like I love like Watchmen. I think behind me somewhere on here, I've got my something like 11 different versions of Watchmen up there. It's my absolute favorite comic. It's a classic for a reason, but I don't know if I would throw Watchmen
This is the
at
first thing for you to read.
99% of the population and say, read this, because it's probably not. I think that there are titles out there that are universal and got the media tied to it. Um, I think that I do think that the original Ultimate Spider-Man by Brian Bendis and Steve Bagley. Those are great comics, but of course, there's some fantastic Superman. I think Superman for All Seasons is a good book to look at. Even I think was it Birthright? Is it Mark Wade? I'm trying to remember who did that.
Yes. I
Uh,
think.
See, middle age is catching up again. But there even Batman. I think that there's some great books. I definitely would not start with like Killing Joke or
Oh,
it's
you got to be in a mood for that.
yeah. And I do think Year One's a great one to
Yeah.
put on somebody, but you have to understand it is like dark.
Yeah.
It's not like Batman flying around with all the Bat family. It is just Batman
And
by himself.
trades serve a great purpose for that too, because like you might have a great story. I may not recommend to somebody, hey, go to a comic book store right now, whatever Batman is on the shelf, get that one. This is
Right.
like, I don't know, but a trade of a great story is always a good place to start. you
Yeah,
know?
and I think DC and Marvel are doing a great job. Marvel calls them Epic Collections. DC calls them DC Finest. They've got some of those stories out there. Marvel, you can find some of those stories that the movies are based on, but even then, some of those are like Bronze Age stories that the modern reader might not like. So I always say, what's your character? What kind of character are you interested in? Or is there a genre? Or is there that creator? I know that as I have aged in this medium, I have started to really follow creators more than characters. So if someone like Alan Moore does something, I'm there. If someone like Howard Chaykin does something, I'm there. I don't really care for maybe this character they're doing or whatever, but I trust that individual. With Spider-Man, I don't know. He's had so many cooks in the kitchen that I might not like that dish that they cook,
Yeah.
but there's plenty out there, and I think having an idea of what you want, what you're looking for is really good. Your local comic book stores, those people there are very knowledge,able
Those are the
and they
nerds. Use them. Use their knowledge.
yeah, use their knowledge, be all Palpatine and Anakin on that, go and talk with them and they'll give you some great suggestions because that's the beauty of comic books. I think here in the 21st century, 2025, right now, there is a book out there that 99.9% of the population would enjoy. You might not enjoy the superhero stuff, but maybe you pick up an issue of Something is Killing the Children, or maybe you go pick up an issue of the power fantasy, or maybe you do pick up Absolute Batman, and you're like, yeah, I don't really want to see like a traditional Batman story. Your
There
brain,
you
your
go. Yeah.
mind is going to be blown because there's just such great creativity out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really, I think you checked a lot of boxes there because there's just so much available, so much out there, and there's a lot of people that know what they're talking about. This has been a lot of fun. I've had joy talking about all the comic book stuff, the history with you, and I'm glad you could join me for this 50th episode. I wanted someone special. I couldn't get Scott Snyder,
Special
and I was like,
edition.
who is second to Scott Snyder
Scott
in
Snyder.
terms
Okay.
of guest worthiness? And I was like, okay, Brandon Morgan.
Well, I'm glad that at least I'm glad to be at least in the same sentence as Scott Snyder. How about that? Even though I know I'm not even in the same zip code as him. But yeah, no, it's been fun. I'd be glad to come back and talk with you anytime. I'm always down to talk comic books. So
Yes.
thank you so
And
much for having me. I appreciate it.
well, of course, and one more time, I know that the check is cleared, but you have made a huge impact on my life versus my career with teaching, my interest in comic books, my life and all that. So it's made a big difference. I'm greatly appreciative of you. Maybe Mia sometimes isn't appreciative of how much space the comic books take up in our house and
Yeah.
all that, but that's neither here nor there.
Please do not when you talk about me, don't mention the comic book stuff with me. Okay, just tell her that was all you. All right.
It sounds like a plan.
All right.
Um,
Thanks so
well, thanks
much.
again. Yeah, this has been great, and it's been a great end to episodes in 2025. So I hope I can have you on again, maybe in 2026, talk about some more stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Mhm.
Bye.
Yay! Come